Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, and thanks for joining me on another solo episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. Today we are diving into change management, and I want to walk through how to put together a bit of a toolkit for anybody that is tackling some sort of change within their organization. I think there's a lot of different frameworks and kind of methodologies, even specific tools. And what I'd like to do is try to wrap all of that up for folks into kind of the key areas or sections, the things that ultimately will help you to move the needle and land change, right? Like not just land change, get people to adopt those changes, have people be an active part and engaged within those changes. And it obviously goes much further than just sharing kind of some simple tactics. You've heard me share the, why, what, and how framework. This obviously goes much, much deeper than some of the things that I've shared previously. So we all know that change is difficult. We all know that we need ultimately people to buy into the vision of change, the why behind the change, right? So for me, all of this can be wrapped up in an assessment, if you will, for change readiness, right? Again, bunch of different ways that you can do this. I've got a quiz that we built out to help organizations understand how prepared they are for change. So I'll put that in the show notes for folks to check out. Great little tool to just, again, short quiz, answer some questions, and to help you understand just how ready you and your org is for a proposed change, right? So kind of first question to unpack that a bit more, like what else is in this, assessment? What can we do to understand how ready we are to change? Does everybody in the organization or that will be impacted by this specific change, do we know why the change is happening, right? Like we talked about that, the why, the what, and the how. This isn't from your perspective. I think that's a key thing to understand. It's kind of like culture. Culture is not like change, right? Culture, like change, is not what you say. It's what others feel and say, how others articulate what is happening around them. Change is no different, right? So if a outsider were to come into your organization and have a conversation with someone or multiple people across your team, across your organization, would they be able to articulate why this particular change was happening, right? One of my favorite kind of stories or examples for this is oftentimes in, let's say, an ERP implementation, right? You may ask somebody, why are we having to switch from Oracle to SAP? Why are we having to switch from a homegrown legacy environment to Microsoft Dynamics? When you ask those questions, a lot of times, and unfortunately more times than not, you'll get I don't know. It's a really good question. Our old system worked just fine. Why don't you ask so-and-so, right? It's very defensive, and there's not a lot of great context around why this change is happening. So right there, we know that not only are we going to struggle to adopt and utilize, in this case, in my example, a new ERP environment, but you're probably going to see a lot of culture change negative culture change. You're probably going to see people cycle through that environment, right? So again, very simply, does everybody understand the change? When we can bring folks together into that vision and articulate to them, what the impact to them as the people utilizing this thing, in our case, the ERP implementation, can they articulate that? Do they understand the what behind that, right? How engaged are people in the change process? Again, going back to the why, the what, the how. If we've tackled and checked the box off on the why and the what, the easiest thing to do is the how, in terms of getting people to engage with ideas to ultimately help improve. Now, in the initial example, the ERP implementation, that unfortunately could be driven by a lot of other factors, right? It could be a end of life type of scenario. It could be, a financial decision. So there's, some other dynamics to be considered. All that said, it doesn't mean that we can't still bring folks into the conversation, because again, when specific to, like big technology platform implementations, like an ERP, like a WMS, or like even an analytics platform, let's say like a third-party bolt-on type of a tool, right? If we don't understand the people, the process, then the adoption of the folks that ultimately have to use this tool in these examples, right? It's going to be lackluster. It's really, really going to struggle. Sure, you're going to get some people to use it because of, you can kind of force that scenario, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be accepted. It doesn't mean that you're not going to cycle through people. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be, an undesired impact to your culture, right? So understanding the change, how engaged are people in the change process, and then, kind of rating ourselves, if you will, right? As we're talking about in an assessment here, but how effective are we at communicating all of this stuff, right? Are there regular feedback sessions? Is there some sort of feedback loop built into your change process? I was chatting with somebody the other day, and was saying, they built out and implemented this really cool, tool to solve a problem that they were challenged with. But the very next sentence was that they were struggling with adoption and utilization of this really cool new tool, right? So that immediately tells me that there probably wasn't a lot of engagement and understanding of this change across the folks that ultimately need to utilize this thing. And therefore, right, we're missing an opportunity from a communication and an effectiveness standpoint. We're missing an opportunity to continue to cycle through the continuous improvement loop, right? By constantly asking for feedback and, clarifying gaps, right? Like, so that was the feedback for this particular person. It's like, hey, this is a great opportunity to not just inspect what you expect and kind of audit for some compliance. That's an opening to start asking these questions. What problems are you facing when using this tool? Is there something we didn't consider when we were building it out? Because again, we skipped over the step of how do we engage people in this process, right? So it all starts with a assessment for change. Again, like, how prepared are we for it? For me, the kind of next, additive part of that is a general, kind of culture evaluation. So this is a bit more of a holistic look at, what's the general feel from a culture perspective when it comes to change, right? Do folks typically think that, oh, I'm not going to listen to what Bob says. I'm not going to listen to what Dave says because, last month it was this month it's, this thing, and next month it'll be something different, right? Or is there a real, bought in culture of continuous improvement? Do people really celebrate feedback and tough kind of discussions, right? Like those difficult conversations. Do people appreciate that when it comes from the floor up into leadership? Or is it easily dismissed as, those people, right? So we're looking for those types of interactions and clues, really, right? To understand, like, what's the overall organization like when it comes to change, I think that is probably one of the most telling, it's kind of the most telling signal of how successful companies will be ultimately, not just, changing in the short term, but kind of growing sustainably, right? Because the organizations that really struggle from a culture, from a change culture perspective, what's really interesting about them, and again, I was in a conversation with another connection of mine, and they had a really lofty goal at their organization, to hit 100 million in sales. They were, kind of a fraction of that at the current time, but they had a roadway, kind of pathway, a roadmap to get there, had a lot of momentum going on. And the conversation was really about like the underlying organization and did it have the infrastructure to support that? And what I see a lot of times is that you can kind of claw your way to growth and kind of get there through brute force. But what ultimately happens is that you really struggle to kind of deliver on the back end of that. And that breaks down in a whole host of different ways. But when you consistently struggle to deliver on or fulfill that kind of promise, right? It's very short-lived. So when I talk about sustainable growth, I'm talking about growth year over year over year over year. I'm talking about places that people compete, to work with, right? And to work within. These are places that attract the top tier talent. They're very well compensated generally. It's a culture not just of inclusion, but where people are really kind of celebrated for their contributions. So it's more than monetary. Generally, these are also tied to like social missions, kind of making it's bigger than just us. It's bigger than us selling this widget or delivering this service, right? There's all these really, really unique kind of components that go into it. So when I'm going into an organization and I'm kind of unpacking this and I'm thinking through like, how prepared is this company for change to not just implement it in the short term, but to support it in the long term, because change is what is required to constantly, hit these new milestones, right? To have exponential growth and sustained exponential growth. So it's a really interesting dynamic to unpack. And these are the questions, right? You can ask of yourself. You certainly don't need a third party to be able to come in and do this. But what you do have to be is, kind of hard on yourself. You have to look in the mirror. You have to have some self-reflection, depending on where you sit in the leadership org chart, and you have to do that across your organization. So if you're at the top of the pyramid, right, you've got to do that for your leadership team. You've got to do that for your middle management layer, and you got to do that for the folks that are closest to the thing. If you're in any one of those other touch points that I just mentioned, you can measure, the other folks, right? Like, so generally the folks that you report to and up, you can measure them against this same thing. Like, what's it typically like when I want to suggest doing, this? Do you have everybody underneath you saying like, yeah, let's go, let's get it, I totally, love this idea, and then you go to present it to, your leadership, and they're like, oh, I don't know, we tried that before, Joe, he used to do that and it didn't really work, right? So you can start to understand the dynamics from more of an overall culture perspective outside of the kind of initial, tactic, if you will, right? From a change, kind of more specific change perspective. Again, like when it comes to, kind of implementing these changes, right? Like thinking through how do we include stakeholders throughout the organization? Again, this is an area that I see a lot of opportunity for folks, because typically what happens is that, and this is like a long-standing thing. I've talked about it from other perspectives, but we're kind of trained, right? Like we are trained to kind of seek efficiency within our bounds, right? Call it a silo, call it our area of expertise, and this applies at work, it applies at home, it applies within our families, this applies everywhere. This is like ingrained in us. So how this relates to folks from a change management perspective is that, when it comes to problem solving, which is typically the kind of, the trigger event for change, right? We're trying to solve a problem. We need to change in order to solve this problem. Need to change something, right? But what we tend to do is we focus within ourselves, right? Like within our bounds, within our area of expertise. It's really easy to do this, especially in, some medium and on up organizations where you have a lot of either layers up and down or kind of process boundaries across of it, an organization. And what ultimately ends up happening is you have like these parallel tracks of trying to solve a problem. The issue is, right, like nobody's talking to each other. It's like, so in a lot of scenarios, like how do we get stakeholders from across the organization to come together and, share in this, right? Like share in the conversation, share in the problem solving efforts. Again, like bringing people, from, every one of the potential touch points. So I'm talking across the organization, and then as well as from different leadership layers and or direct and indirect layers. I've seen misses both ways, always too, like I've seen misses everywhere when it comes to this. So that's kind of number one. Number two to that is like, how intimate or deep are they involved, right? Like, is this, again, I go back to like the lip service thought process, right? Like, is this just lip service, or is this, are they actively involved in helping us to figure out this thing and to move the needle forward, right? So we obviously want to be able to have them intimately involved. And again, this is, a resource allocation conversation because everybody has other stuff going on. But, that's when you start to think about like, how much of a priority is this for our organization? What resources do we need to deploy ultimately to solve this problem, move the needle forward, right? The last part of, of this, and it kind of rolls into the next section, but it's, the kind of regular updates, the effective communication. How do we keep everybody, both people that are involved in the change management aspect, and then outside of that, again, depending on how complex or large your organization is, right, or how small and tight knit it is. This has to ebb and flow. It has to make sense for the organization based on, who needs access to this information, right? You may present a different kind of version of the story, right? Like the super highlight reel for executive leaders or board members. You may need to get really into the weeds when it gets all the way down to kind of, indirect stakeholders, right? Because Sure, they need some context. Sure, they need to understand like how the direct impact is going to affect them, right, from an indirect perspective. So it's all of those things, right? Building that kind of communication plan in, making sure that there's consistency within and throughout that communication plan. Again, looking for those opportunities to kind of cycle through continuous improvement through feedback loops and those types of activities, right? So that is all part of it. Now, the very last thing from a, kind of, again, we're talking through like a change management toolkit perspective. One of the areas that almost always gets overlooked is risk mitigation, right? Like impact evaluation, risk management. And, it tends to get overlooked or kind of brushed off to the side for obviously a variety of reasons. But again, like if we don't start the conversation here and we don't start to unpack some of these potential issues, we could really be opening ourselves up for, for disasters. So just like talking about the how from a kind of tactical perspective, right, and involving people, engaging people in this change process, doing the same thing from a risk management and mitigation perspective, like what's going to happen if we don't do this, thing? What's at risk? Is business at risk? Is our, intellectual property at risk? Is technology at risk, right? Like all of those different things. So kind of like getting that on the list to understand again, like what are we up against? Like what happens? One of my first, I'll share this with you. This is a great, like, risk kind of management discussion, right? One of the first, kind of assignments I had, if you will, in my, kind of corporate career, right? I went to work for a facility that was running on a legacy ERP environment. And so much of a legacy ERP environment that we were literally kind of one lightning strike away from not being able to generate orders. And the reason for that is because it was a outdated kind of end of life scenario. We were running on tape backups that we could no longer get, the tapes for. So we're recycling tapes. So even the data itself within the system was at risk. And I'll never kind of forget having that conversation. Like we were such a small facility that we weren't, even on the list to be considered for an update. And I kind of remember calling my boss at the time. We had like this really bad storm, and I kind of utilized that as like the jumping off point. But I was like, look, Terry, like we are in a situation that if we have a really bad storm that comes through here, like we may not be able to write orders up, right? Like not only that, we may not be able to get access to like historical information outside of our physical, like job jackets and stuff. And like to me, being the guy, on the ground floor that's in charge of this facility, also being tasked with how are we going to grow this facility, was like, that was really scary, right? So utilizing that, kind of risk as a leverage point, right, for change. And then obviously utilizing that, as we're talking about it and presenting that to the folks that are doing the thing, right? Like talking about that, like, guys, look, yeah, this implementation, we have to take under this implementation. Why? Because we're at risk of not being able to effectively, like service our clients, right? Like that's a huge issue. So, risk, I find oftentimes, as I said earlier, kind of gets swept to the side or kind of overlooked, for a variety of reasons, but definitely something that you want to have not just on your radar and have regular conversations about, right? But like put some real rating, kind of like risk assessment around these things to understand ultimately, what the impact is. So That was a lot to unpack about change management. I hope that you got a little bit more actionable information out of this episode than maybe just sharing some higher level frameworks and some thoughts and ideas around each one of these different areas as it pertains to change within your organization. As a reminder, these solo episodes are an extension of our weekly Business System Saturday newsletter. You can find all of that information on our website. I'll also link that in the show notes so you can hit that and subscribe easily. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.